Yeah, it's crazy. And I mean, I was just going to ask you, like, we're sitting in two very developed nations. We spend a lot of money on healthcare, and yet we look like we're very, very sick. What? How did all this happen? How did we get to this spot?
Well, do you want to go back in time to history to Rockefeller
Let's go
medicine?
back in time. Let's go
I
back
love
in
this
time.
story. Let's do it. Here's the deal. Back in the late 1800s, 1861 to 1865, we had the American Civil War. Right up through that entire point, they were actually using herbs and botanicals. In fact, Dr. Francis Porcher actually released a book, I believe it was 1862, called Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests. Now, he was a botanist, physician and a botanist, and his mom had plant-based medicine and stuff as well. So he grew up around this. And all these infections, gangrene that all these soldiers were getting from the Civil War, he created this book, and the Surgeon General said, distribute this to everyone far and wide. That was their number one priority, was getting this book out to all the armies and all the camps. And what they did is they picked all the plants and the herbs around the area and made medicine, which helped these soldiers heal up. And many historians actually say the war should have ended in 63, but it went all the way to 1865 because of this book that was created. And I believe that was actually the Confederate side, if I'm not mistaken. So we have been using herbs and plants for thousands of years, right up to the documented 1865, where things are really, right at the crest rather of the Industrial Revolution. Well, here we are now, late 1800s, and John D. Rockefeller founds Standard Oil. And what he realized very quickly is that these petroleum byproducts you could actually use to make things like drugs and medicine. So he paired up with the steel tycoon, Andrew Carnegie. And so here you have John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie paired up together and said, we want to reform the medical system. Now, there's a nice intent. Well, they looked at all these medical colleges and schools, said, look, some people are practicing sound waves and frequencies. Some people are practicing herbs or homeopathy. Some people are just winging it and guessing. Like there's no standardization of medicine. So they said, we want to standardize everything. And this is where they took Abraham Flexner, he was actually a school teacher, and said, we want you to run across all 155 medical colleges across America. And we want you to take a look and see what they're doing, document their stuff, come on back. And in 1911, if I'm not mistaken, or 1911 maybe, he published what's called the Flexner Report, which was just a scathing review of all the medical colleges. And he said, everything's wrong, nothing is standardized, we need medicine. So here we are. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, and Carnegie, the steel tycoon, started funding schools and started using these petroleum byproducts to create what we now know as pharmaceuticals. And all these medicines went out to the colleges through their political influence, lobbying, fundraising, and financial power, being the wealthiest people in America. The long and short is they went to these schools and said, you need to do what we tell you. Get on this new curriculum, our pharmaceuticals and petroleums, or you lose your funding and shut down. Nearly half of all schools shut down. I think it was 90 some percent of natural medicine, herbal medicine schools shut down. Or collectively, nearly half of all medical colleges in the USA had shut down. And they then reformed and rebuilt what we have today, known as big pharmaceutical medicine. And this is what now governs. They had their hands in the FDA, the American Heart Association, Cancer Association. All these things have been rooted by the Rockefellers, by political and financial influence, by this mega, richest family in America. And that has what's now shaped medicine as we see it today. Big Pharma funds about 25% of medical school on average, some schools more like 50%. They determine the tests, the labs that get run, they determine all the things the doctors learn what gets put in the textbook. Therefore, I would call it medical indoctrination. And so the problem is now where we stand is in medicine, you have people with these chronic inflammatory diseases or conditions. And what we have now is we take chronic inflammation and we treat it with acute treatment chronically. We use anti inflammatories on a chronic recurring basis to keep the inflammation under control. This is what we call sick care, not health care. We're not going to the roots to say, why is my body inflamed? What is it trying to heal me or protect me from? And what does it need to do the job? It's like your body is screaming for help through symptoms. It's communicating to you. And we put tape over its mouth and we go, look, we fixed it. And then you live with chronic disease. Collectively, now, what this has done to answer the original question about finances, between three major industries, the biggest ones in the USA. You have hospital stays, pharmaceuticals, and health insurance are the three biggest industries that make up 4.7 trillion with a T, $4.7 trillion a year in North America. That's 18% of the entire country's GDP. 18%, nearly one fifth of the entire country's profits come from sickness, disease, and medicine. And to push that one step further before I shut up off my rant here, Casey, North America is less than 5%. Well, I'm going to say Canada, US, next Mexico, but Canada, US is less than 5% of the entire global population. They make up nearly 70% of the global pharmaceutical profits. We have a problem.
That is a problem. That is absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate you going into detail with that and the history. And then you mentioned those three industries. What about a fourth one that shouldn't be too far behind, which is the food industry? And you think about how that story fit in with, Procter and Gamble, and they creating, food from seed oils, if you want to call it food, and the story of
100%.
Crisco, and then
Frankenfoods, yeah.
exactly. And you mentioned the American Heart Association, how they got wrapped up in making the cholesterol recommendations, and Ansel Keys and all these other stories of people making money from a completely novel system, moving away from all those things that you mentioned earlier that we used to use to help people actually make them better. And I love the way you described we're using acute treatments chronically to fix chronic problems. What a disaster.
It is a disaster. And here's the thing, depends on what side of the aisle you sit on. Oh, it's a conspiracy. It's actually documented fact. If you just put it together in chronological order, it is extraordinarily damning. In fact, John D. Rockefeller was quoted allegedly, again, it's not in print, from his own words, but it was allegedly at some conference. He had said, competition is a sin. And so he goes out to squash and nix everybody to monopolize this industry. And now pharmaceutical companies control the world. They really do. You have every major news organization and news station, which is basically a propaganda station, has somebody from the pharmaceutical board sitting on the board. There are two countries in the world that actually allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise on TV. USA is one of them. The other one, I believe, is New Zealand.
Correct.
Everyone else says no. So we do have what looks to be corporate America, where we have all these mega corporations, quote, lobbying. It's like bribery with no extra steps. It's just hidden behind political lingo. But they lobby, they purchase, they fund campaigns and do all these things to get Congress and to get politicians to vote in their favor. And this is where we now have the FDA, who, again, back to Rockefeller and big food and the big circle jerk it all is, are now all in this. And I will say it is a huge conspiracy. You have big food who gets you sick, so you rely on big pharma. When, in order to do that, what do you have to do? You have to get a job that you hate for benefits you should never need to treat a disease or manage a disease you never should have had.